You're now watching Qnews. Here are the top stories for this hour. Hamas has announced receiving several proposals for a ceasefire in Gaza in recent weeks and responded with what it described as responsibility and openness. Hamas further accused Israel of reneging on an agreement previously signed between the two sides, saying the Israeli government refused to move to the second phase of the deal and has resumed its military offensive on the Gaza Strip. Families and tribal leaders in the southern Gaza have called on residents across the Gaza Strip to take the streets on Friday in mass protests demanding the removal of Hamas from power. In a public statement, they accused Hamas of harming Gaza's youth and exploiting them for political ends. The families stressed the need for a political solution that restores peace and security without further displacement or destruction, and urged Hamas members to abandon the group in favor of the national interests. Jordan Foreign Minister Ayman al-Safadi has called for coordinated international efforts to stop Israeli military assault on Gaza. During a meeting in Amman with German Interior Minister and Austrian counterparts, al-Safadi emphasized the need to impose a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire and to open border crossings for the delivery of humanitarian aid across the Gaza Strip. Thousands of Israeli protesters gathered outside the Knesset, calling for new elections and the return of detainees still held in Gaza. Among those attending was former Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who called it a very important demonstration. The protests coincided with a parliamentary session debating a controversial bill to change the committee that appoints judges, a move critics say could trigger a constitutional crisis and expand government powers. It also came just one day after the Knesset narrowly approved the long-delayed 2025 state budget following a heated debate that highlighted deep divisions over the detainee fates and Israel's political future. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned that Israel could seize territory in Gaza if Hamas does not release the remaining detainees. Speaking at the Knesset, Netanyahu stated that increased force would be used, and the longer Hamas delay, the more powerful the repression. His remarks were repeatedly interpreted by opposition lawmakers, one of whom was removed after calling the Prime Minister an inciter. And moving on to Yemen, where U.S. forces launched a series of airstrikes targeted Houthi-controlled areas around Yemen's capital Sana'a, according to Houthi-run media. The strike hit multiple locations north and south of the city, including 8 strikes in the Jerban area of Sanhan district and 5 in the Beni Hashish district. The Dailami airbase, located north of Sana'a, was also targeted with 2 airstrikes. The United States says it is still reviewing the agreement reached with both Ukraine and Russia earlier this week. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio clarified that the deals were agreements in principle, noting that Washington is now evaluating the conditions laid out by Moscow before deciding on the next steps. Under the proposed deal, both Ukraine and Russia agreed to pose a tax at sea and on energy infrastructure. In return, the U.S. signaling willingness to push for the easing of some sanctions on Russia. However, shortly after the U.S. announcement, the Kremlin responded, saying the agreement concerning the Black Sea would not take effect unless some Russian banks are reconnected to the international financial system.
I think it's a good thing that we have both the Ukrainians and the Russians talking about ceasefires, be they energy or
French President Emmanuel Macron has announced that France will provide an additional 2 billion euros in military aid to Ukraine. Speaking alongside Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Paris, Macron said the new package includes anti-tank and surface-to-air missiles, armored vehicles, drones, and additional Mirage fighter jets. He also accused Russia of rewriting the terms of recent limited ceasefire agreements. The announcement comes ahead of a summit involving around 30 world leaders aimed at strengthening support for Ukraine, reviewing ceasefire and discussing Europe's long-term role in supporting Ukraine. For his part, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has expressed hopes that the United States can exert enough pressure on Russia to secure an unconditional ceasefire. His remarks came after Moscow proposed conditions on halting strikes in the Black Sea under a deal brokered by Washington. Speaking at a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, Zelensky stressed that sanctions on Russia should not only remain in place but be strengthened. Kiev had earlier stated it was ready to implement the agreement immediately. Furthermore, Denmark has welcomed a U.S. decision to limit a planned visit to Greenland to a military base following tensions over what Copenhagen called political pressure on the semi-autonomous territory. The controversy began when Usha Vance, wife of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, was scheduled to attend a major dog sled race in Greenland. Denmark's Prime Minister called the move unacceptable. The White House later announced J.D. Vance himself would lead the delegation, but only to visit the U.S. space base at Pituffik. Denmark's foreign minister called the move a positive step towards the escalation. This concludes our top stories for this hour. Many thanks for watching and goodbye.